Hi, welcome to Midnight Whisper Stories, where every night hides a new nightmare. I am the creator behind this channel, and every story he is written, designed, and edited by me. I make these tales to give you chills, escape, and a reason to keep the lights on. Stay till the end. You won't believe how this one ends.
Story 1. Lullaby of St. Mary. As I heard the singing before I understood what I was hearing. That is the part that keeps me awake at night. Not the fear, not the sickness in my stomach or the way my hands shake when I think about it. It's the fact that I didn't recognize it as wrong at first. I thought it was just the wind, the way it moves through old buildings in Alaska, whistling through cracks in the foundation, moaning against the metal gutters. But wind doesn't sing in perfect pitch. Wind doesn't the melody to a lullaby. My name is Marcus Chen. I am a registered nurse, and I've worked in hospitals across the country for 23 years. I'm telling you this now because I can't keep it to myself anymore, and I need people to know what is happening in that place. What is still happening? Because I believe it is still happening, even though I haven't been back there since that night in January. I took the job at St. Mary, this hospital in Dillingham, Alaska, 8 months ago. Dillingham is small, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody else. This business, where the winter darkness lasts for weeks, and the snow piles up so high that the town feels buried alive. The hospital sits on the edge of town, an old building that was constructed in the 1950s, and you can feel its age the moment you walk through the doors. The walls have that particular coldness that comes from decades of northern winters seeping into the concrete and steel, no matter how much they crank the heat. I was hired to work in the neonatal unit, the NICU. It's the smallest department in the hospital, only 12 beds, and during the quiet months, barely half of them are filled. The head nurse was a woman named Patricia, who had been there for 30 years. She warned me on my first day about the sounds. She didn't call them lullabies then. She just said, "You will hear things after midnight during the bad snow." Don't mind it. It's just the old place settling. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. The first time I heard it clearly was a Tuesday night in late November. The snow had been falling since early morning, thick and relentless, covering the roads and the town beyond like a shroud. The power flickered twice around 9 o'clock, and the backup generators kicked in with a low hum that you could feel in your bones. I was working the night shift, and at midnight, the unit was quiet. We had only 3 infants in the NICU that night, all stable, all sleeping. The monitors beeped in their regular rhythm, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and ethereal, coming from somewhere beyond the walls of the unit, or perhaps from the walls themselves. It was a lullaby, and the melody was so achingly beautiful that it made me ache in my chest. I stepped out into the hallway, listening. The singing seemed to come from the east wing, from the older section of the hospital that we didn't use anymore. That section had been closed off for years. The doors were locked, the rooms empty and dark. I walked toward the sound, my shoes making soft squeaking noises against the linoleum floor. The lullaby grew louder as I approached the locked door at the end of the hall. I could hear the words now, though they were in a language I didn't recognize. Not Spanish, not French, something older, something that predated modern language. My hand reached for the door handle. It was ice cold, so cold that I gasped and pulled my hand back. Frost was forming on the metal in the shape of something that looked almost like a note. A musical note. The singing stopped. I stood there in the hallway for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then I turned and walked back to the NICU as quickly as I could without running. When I checked on the 3 infants, they were still asleep, still stable. I told myself I had imagined the whole thing. Stress, exhaustion, too much coffee and not enough sleep. But Patricia knew I had heard something. I could see it in her eyes the next morning. Over the next 2 weeks, the singing came every night, always during the heavy snow, always after midnight, and every time I investigated, the singing would stop before I could reach its source. The frost on the doors grew more elaborate, forming not just single notes but entire staffs of music, complete measures that looked like they had been written by a careful hand with years of practice. I documented it. I took photographs on my phone, even though hospital policy forbade it. The images didn't capture the frost the way I saw it in person. The phone camera showed only blurry shapes, as if something was resisting the documentation. By the third week of December, other nurses had started to notice the singing too. We never spoke about it directly. You don't, in a place like that. There, as an unspoken agreement that you acknowledge the strangeness just enough to confirm that you were not crazy, but not so much that you give it real weight or real names. But I could see the fear in the other nurses' eyes. I could see it in the way Patricia moved through the unit, always checking on the older sections, always watching the locked doors. I started researching the hospital, its history. There was a reference library in the break room, dusty volumes about Dillingham and the surrounding region. I found a mention in a book from 1965. In the winter of 1964, a severe influenza outbreak had swept through the region. The hospital's neonatal unit had been overwhelmed with sick infants. The old building, with its poor heating and inadequate ventilation, had become a death trap for the most vulnerable patients. 42 infants died that winter. The book included a photograph of the maternity ward from that era, a grainy black and white image showing nurses in old-fashioned uniforms standing beside bassinets. And in the background, just visible through the window, snow was falling on Dillingham like a blanket of ice. 42 babies, gone. Lost to a disease that would be treatable with modern medicine but was a death sentence in 1964 in a remote Alaskan town. I felt something shift in my understanding of the singing. It wasn't malicious, I realized. It was mournful. It was grief. The lullabies were a memory, a ghost, this memory of songs sung to dying infants. Perhaps a nurse who had tried to comfort them in their final moments. Perhaps the infants themselves, trapped in some space between death and whatever comes after. December deepened. The snow became almost constant, and the town felt increasingly isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. The temperature dropped to 25 below zero, and the wind howled around the hospital like something alive and conscious. The lullabies grew louder. I began to recognize the melodies, though I knew I had never heard them before. They felt ancestral, like memories that had been passed down through generations and implanted in my subconscious. Then something changed. On December 28th, a pregnant woman came into the emergency department in active labor. Her name was Sarah. She was 18 years old, alone, with no prenatal care. She had hidden her pregnancy under loose clothing until she couldn't hide it anymore. The baby came 3 weeks early. A girl, beautiful and screaming, but with complications. Respiratory distress. The baby was transferred to the NICU immediately. That night, the singing changed. Instead of coming from the locked East Wing, it came from the NICU itself. It came from all around us, as if the walls themselves were singing. I was working that shift, standing vigil over Sarah's daughter, watching the monitors, checking the oxygen saturation, doing everything I could to keep this tiny life tethered to the world. The lullaby grew louder and more insistent. It was no longer mourning. It was calling. Patricia found me standing frozen beside the infant, his bassinet at 2 a.m. She grabbed my arm, and her grip was strong enough to hurt. "Stop listening," she whispered, her voice intense and terrified. "Don, to listen to the singing. Don, to let them call you into the old sections. And Don, let the baby listen." I looked at her, confused and frightened. "Patricia, what is this? What is happening?" She didn't answer me directly. Instead, she led me to the break room and locked the door behind us. She pulled out a manila folder, old and worn, with documents inside that looked like they had been handled many times over the decades. They were records of the 1964 outbreak. But more than that, they were notes. Personal observations made by the head nurse at the time, a woman named Eleanor Voss. Eleanor had documented everything. The singing, the frost on the windows forming musical patterns, and something else, something that made my skin crawl. The infants who listened to the singing the longest, the ones that Eleanor noted seemed most responsive to the lullabies, were the ones who died first. Not from the influenza, Eleanor had noted in her shaky handwriting. The music seemed to accelerate their decline, drain their will to fight. The sicker infants, the ones barely breathing when they arrived, would seem to grow calmer after hearing the singing. Their vital signs would improve temporarily. They would seem peaceful, almost serene, and then they would simply stop fighting. Their hearts would slow. Their breathing would cease. Eleanor had tried everything. She had sealed the windows. She had worked with priests to bless the rooms. She had put headphones on the infants' ears, playing other music, trying to drown out the mysterious lullabies. Nothing worked. The singing seemed to come from inside the walls, from the very architecture of the building itself. And then, on February 3rd, 1964, the singing stopped. All the remaining infants recovered. The outbreak ended. The surviving babies were discharged and went home to their families. But Eleanor, as notes recorded a final, chilling observation. The singing has ceased. I have a theory, though I dare not speak it aloud. I fear that it has taken what it needed, that we have fed it our grief and our dying, and now it sleeps, satisfied, until the next time winter brings desperation to our doors. I read those words, and I understood what was happening. Sarah's daughter was in danger. The singing intensified over the next 4 days. The baby's condition didn't improve with treatment. Standard protocols weren't working. She seemed listless, unresponsive, her body increasingly inert despite the oxygen and the antibiotics and everything else we did. The lullabies grew so loud that I was surprised the other staff couldn't hear them. But when I asked, they said they heard nothing. Only I heard it. Only I and the other nurses who had been there long enough to understand. The frost on the windows of the NICU formed increasingly complex patterns, entire symphonies of ice crystals arranged in notes and staffs that made perfect mathematical sense and no sense at all. I realized that if you trace the patterns in the right order, if you followed them from window to window, they formed a complete musical composition. A lullaby composed of winter itself. On the fourth night, I made a decision. I disconnected the monitors from Sarah's daughter's bassinet. Not the oxygen, not the medications, but the monitors that tracked her vital signs. I carried her into the supply closet, into the deepest, most windowless part of the NICU, where the singing couldn't reach her. I held her tiny body against my chest, and I sang to her. I sang anything I could think of. Nursery rhymes, pop songs, anything that wasn't a lullaby, anything that wasn't beautiful in the way that the mysterious singing was beautiful. The lullabies raged around us, pressing against the walls of the supply closet like something trying to break through. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath. My teeth chattered. The baby in my arms cried. And her cries were strong and healthy and beautifully, perfectly normal. And then, at dawn, the singing stopped. The temperature returned to normal. The frost began to melt on the windows. When I emerged from the supply closet with Sarah's daughter, the monitors showed her vital signs improving, stabilizing, moving toward recovery. Within a week, the baby was released. Sarah took her daughter home. But I knew the truth now. I understood what the hospital wanted, what it had always wanted. I gave my resignation notice the next day. I told them I had family issues back east, which was entirely untrue. I moved out of Dillingham as soon as I could book a flight. I haven't been back, and I never intend to return. The reason I am telling you this now is that I received a phone call last week. It was Patricia. She said that another pregnant woman had come to the hospital in active labor in the midst of a severe winter storm. The baby, another girl, had breathing complications, and the singing had started again. Patricia wanted to know if I would come back, if I would remember the things I had learned, if I would be willing to protect another child from whatever force dwells in those walls, in those rooms where infants died in 1964, in that season of loss and grief that never really ended. I told her no, I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back to that place. I thought I could leave it behind. I thought that by refusing to return, I could pretend it wasn't real. But the truth is, I've been hearing the lullabies in my dreams every night since I left. I've been finding frost forming on my own bedroom windows in perfectly geometric patterns, regardless of the temperature outside or the weather conditions. And 3 nights ago, I heard a baby crying from somewhere inside my apartment walls, singing a melody that I recognized from Alaska, a lullaby in a language that doesn't exist, and yet somehow I understand every word. I think it followed me. I think something from St. Mary, this hospital, followed me home. And I think it is still hungry. The question I need you to answer, the question that haunts me, is this: how many other hospitals exist in small towns across America? How many other places where infants died in outbreaks or disasters? How many other buildings where grief and loss has seeped into the very foundations? How many of them are singing to the vulnerable right now? Tell me in the comments. Tell me if you've ever heard a lullaby you couldn't quite explain. Tell me if you've ever seen frost forming musical patterns on your windows. Tell me if you've heard the singing in your own walls. because I think I'm not the only one. And I think we need to talk about this. We need to share what we know before the singing reaches more children. Before it reaches yours. Story 2. Shadow that walks alone. My shadow left me on the third day of the polar night. Let me ask you something. Have you ever looked down and realized your shadow wasn't doing what you were doing? That it was moving on its own, like it had somewhere else to be? I am a high school teacher, 49 years old. Moved to Kotzebue, Alaska 5 years ago for a fresh start after my divorce. Small town on the edge of the Arctic, population 3,000. The kind of place where everyone knows your business and the sun disappears for 65 days every winter. They call it the polar night. 2 months of darkness broken only by a few hours of twilight around noon. Most people adjust, get used to the permanent dusk. The way streetlights become your sun and your circadian rhythm forgets what normal means. But nobody warned me about what happens to shadows when the real darkness comes. It started in late November. The sun had been gone for 3 days. I was walking home from the school, boots crunching on snow that squeaked in the cold. Temperature was 15 below, the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze and your lungs ache. I passed under a streetlight, and something caught my eye. My shadow on the snow beside me. Except it wasn't beside me. It was 3 feet ahead, walking faster than I was. Leading the way, I stopped walking. My shadow kept going. Took 2 more steps before it stopped too. Waited, like it was impatient, like it had places to be and I was slowing it down. I convinced myself I imagined it. Exhaustion. The darkness playing tricks. I'd been working long hours, and the lack of sunlight was getting to me like it got to everyone their first polar night. But over the next few days, I started noticing it everywhere. My shadow moving a fraction of a second after I did, turning its head when mine was still, gesturing with hands that didn't match my own movements. Other people noticed too. I see them on the street, stopping suddenly to stare at the ground. Looking confused, frightened. But nobody talked about it. Not at first. Because how do you start that conversation? How do you tell someone your shadow has stopped obeying you? On the 7th day of darkness, I woke up at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. My bedroom was pitch black except for the red glow of my alarm clock. I didn't turn on the light, just stumbled across the room in the dark. Halfway to the door, I saw it. My shadow, cast against the wall by the alarm clock, this faint red light. It was standing perfectly still while I was moving, arms at its sides, head turned toward me, watching me with attention that shadows shouldn't possess. I flipped on the light. The shadow snapped back into position, matched my movements perfectly, like nothing had happened, like I imagined the whole thing, but I hadn't. And the next morning, walking to school in the twilight gloom, I saw them. Dozens of shadows gathered at the frozen shoreline where the town met the Kotzebue Sound. They stood in clusters, some alone, all of them facing the ice, pointing, not at anything I could see, just pointing at specific spots on the frozen water with an insistence that made my stomach turn. The shadows belonged to people. I could see the faint connections, threads of darkness stretching back toward town, toward the living bodies they left behind. But the bodies weren't at the shoreline. The bodies were in their homes, in their beds, at their jobs, going about their lives while their shadows congregated at the water, this edge and pointed at the ice like they were showing us something we'd forgotten, something we buried, something that wanted to be found. I called in sick that day, went to the library instead. The old woman who ran it, Martha, was a Kotzebue native. Born here, raised here, survived 70 polar nights. If anyone knew what was happening, it would be her. She didn't look surprised when I asked about the shadows. Just nodded slowly and pulled a folder from a locked drawer. Inside were newspaper clippings from 1983. The shadow plague, they called it. For 3 weeks during that year, this polar night, shadows across Kotzebue had detached from their owners, moved independently, gathered at the shoreline and pointed at the ice. Residents reported feeling watched, followed, like their shadows were studying them, learning them, preparing for something. Then people started disappearing. Not many, just 6 over those 3 weeks. A teenager who'd gone out for a walk and never came home. A fisherman who'd driven his truck onto the ice and vanished. A woman who left her house at midnight and was never seen again. No bodies, no evidence, just gone, like they'd been erased from existence. But their shadows remained, standing at the shoreline with all the others, pointing at the exact spots where their owners had disappeared, marking the locations, preserving the memory even as the town tried to forget. The shadow plague ended when the sun came back. The shadows reconnected, became normal. Everyone convinced themselves it had been mass hysteria. Cabin fever. The darkness doing what darkness does to isolated people. They never found the missing 6. Never solved the cases. Just filed them away and moved on because that is what small towns do when the alternative is admitting something impossible lives in the dark. Martha looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. Told me the shadows were showing us where people were taken. Where they still were. Trapped under the ice in spaces that only existed during the polar night. Places where the darkness was thick enough to hold things. To hide things. To keep them preserved in frozen suspension until someone was brave enough or stupid enough to look. I should have stayed inside. Should have waited for the sun to return in January. But I couldn't. Because that morning, I see my daughter, a shadow at the shoreline. My daughter who lived in Seattle. Who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Who couldn't possibly have a shadow in Kotzebue because she had never been here. Yet there it was, her exact height, her exact build, standing with the others, pointing at a spot about 200 yards offshore. I went to the shoreline that night. Midnight, the coldest part of the darkness. The shadows were waiting, hundreds of them now, some belonging to living people, some belonging to the missing, all of them pointing, all of them silent. My own shadow stood among them, looked at me, gestured for me to follow. I walked onto the ice. The shadows moved with me, not attached anymore, just accompanying me, showing me the way. The ice was thick, safe, the kind of surface you could drive a truck across. But I felt it anyway. The wrongness underneath, the spaces that shouldn't exist, the pockets of darkness that had grown so dense they punched through reality and created voids where things could hide. My daughter. The shadow stopped at a specific spot, pointed down. I knelt, brushed away snow. The ice beneath was different. Cloudy, dark, like someone had poured ink into the water before it froze. I could see shapes moving beneath the surface. Not swimming, not floating, just existing in that dark space. Suspended, waiting. I pulled out the ice chisel I brought, started chopping. Each strike rang out across the silent sound. Each impact sent vibrations through the darkness below. The shapes moved faster, rose toward the surface, pressed against the ice from underneath like hands against glass. I broke through. The ice cracked and water welled up. Not water, something thicker, darker. It smelled like copper and cold and something organic that made me gag. The shapes beneath became clearer. Faces, dozens of faces, pressed against the underside of the ice, looking up at me with eyes that were open but not seeing. Mouths frozen mid-scream, hands reaching upward. My daughter was among them, but not the daughter I knew. This was her at age 7, the age she'd been when we moved to Seattle. When I'd still been married. When she still called me daddy and thought I could fix anything. She floated there in the dark water, perfectly preserved, looking exactly as she had 20 years ago. Looking at me with an expression that wasn't fear or pain but recognition. Like she'd been waiting for me to find her. Like part of her had been here all along. I stumbled backward. My shadow grabbed my arm. Actually grabbed it. I felt cold fingers wrap around my wrist. Felt myself being pulled back from the hole, away from the dark water and the faces and the impossible truth trying to surface. The other shadows surrounded us, formed a circle, not threatening, protecting. They brought me here to show me something. Not to harm me, not to take me, to help me understand what lived in the polar night, what fed on the darkness and the isolation and the desperate loneliness of people trapped in endless winter. It wasn't taking people. It was taking moments, pieces of people's lives, the parts they lost or abandoned or left behind. The daughter I stopped being a father to. The teenager who run away from an abusive home. The fisherman who wanted to escape his failing marriage. The woman who had been trying to forget her past. All of them had pieces of themselves trapped down there, frozen in the dark water, preserved in the spaces where light couldn't reach. And the shadows were trying to show us, trying to help us remember, pointing at the locations where we buried parts of ourselves, where we let pieces of who we were sink beneath the ice rather than deal with the pain of carrying them. I covered the hole. The shadows nodded, seemed satisfied. My daughter, the shadow, reached out, touched my face with fingers that felt like cold air. Then it walked back to shore with the others, resumed pointing, marking the spot, keeping the memory alive even as I tried to forget. I left Kotzebue 3 days later. Couldn't to keep teaching in a place where my shadow moved independently and my daughter, his ghost, stood on frozen water pointing at the pieces of my life I tried to bury. The polar night still had 50 days left. 50 days of shadows gathering, pointing, showing people what they lost. The shadow plague is happening again. I've seen the news reports. Missing persons cases in Kotzebue. 3 so far. People disappearing during walks, during drives, during moments when they got too close to the shoreline and saw what their shadows were pointing at. Saw the faces under the ice. Saw the pieces of themselves they tried to forget. And I know they were not really missing. They were just looking, staring down into the dark water, trying to recognize themselves, trying to decide if they should reach in and pull those pieces back out. Make themselves whole again, even if it means acknowledging the pain, the loss, the parts of their lives they'd rather leave frozen. My shadow still moves independently sometimes, especially at night, especially when I'm alone and thinking about my daughter, about the years I lost, about the father I stopped being. It walks to the window, looks north, points toward Kotzebue, toward the shoreline, toward the spot where a 7-year-old version of my child still floats in the dark water, waiting for me to acknowledge her, to remember her, to bring her back. But I want to go back, because I know what happens when you pull those pieces out. When you try to make yourself whole again, the cold comes with them, the darkness, the weight of everything you tried to leave behind. And some burdens are too heavy to carry. Some pieces are better left frozen. So this is what I need to know. Have you ever felt like part of you was missing? Like you left something important behind somewhere and do you remember where? And have you noticed your shadow acting strange? Moving when you still, pointing at places you afraid to look? Write your answer in the comments. Because I think the shadow plague isn't limited to Kotzebue. I think it happens everywhere during the darkest parts of winter, when the nights are long enough and the cold is deep enough. When we isolated enough to forget who we used to be. That is when the shadows detach. That is when they try to show us what they lost. What is waiting under the ice? What is pointing back at us from the frozen dark? Tell me if your shadow knows something they've forgotten, before the polar night comes for you too. Story 3. Crying masts of Dillingham. The masts were weeping when I arrived at the harbor that morning, and I should have turned around right then. But I needed the work, and in Alaska, you do not walk away from a paycheck just because something sounds wrong. That kind of thinking will get you killed up here. I came to Dillingham in February to crew on fishing boats. 52 years old, recently laid off from a factory job in Michigan, and desperate enough to answer an ad for winter work in a place I had never heard of. Population 2,400, sits on Nushagik Bay, the kind of town that lives and dies by the salmon runs. In winter, the harbor freezes over and the boats lock into the ice like insects in amber. My job was to maintain them, check the hulls, clear snow, make sure nothing was damaged by the cold. The crying started my first morning. I was walking down the dock toward the Sea Ranger, a 70-foot signer that had been iced in since November, when I heard it. A sound like wind through a narrow space, but it was not wind. It was coming from the masts, all of them, every boat in the harbor. A low, keening sound that made my teeth hurt, like someone mourning, like grief made audible. I stopped and listened. The sound rose and fell, rhythmic, almost like breathing. I looked around for other people, thinking maybe it was some kind of equipment malfunction, generators or pumps running somewhere. But the harbor was empty. Just me and 40 boats locked in gray ice under a gray sky. The harbor master, a thick man named Carl with a beard full of ice crystals, found me standing there. He saw the expression on my face and just nodded. "You hear them?" he said. It was not a question. I asked him what made that sound. He looked at the boats, at their tall masts rising like burned trees from the frozen harbor. "They cry before a thaw," he said. "Been doing it since 1974. Since the storm." He told me about the Bering Sea disaster. February of '74, a massive storm came out of nowhere. Took down 5 fishing boats in one night. 37 men lost, most of them from Dillingham. The boats went down so fast nobody had time to get off emergency signals. They found wreckage for months afterward. Bodies, too, when the ice broke up that spring. Since then, every time the weather is about to shift, every time an unexpected thaw is coming, the masts on the dock boats start crying. I thought he was messing with me, the kind of story locals tell newcomers to freak them out. But Carl, his face was serious, dead serious. He told me to pay attention to the sound. Said when the crying gets loud, it means the thaw is close. And when a thaw comes too early in Alaska, when the ice goes soft before it should, bad things happen. People go through, equipment breaks, and sometimes the boats themselves start moving. I spent that first week working alone in the harbor. The crying continued every morning. By day 3, I could distinguish different tones. Some masts wept softly, barely audible. Others wailed. The sound so piercing it made my eyes water. I started wearing headphones, but I could still feel it. A vibration in my chest, in my bones. Then I found the log. I was in the cabin of the Sea Ranger, checking for moisture damage, when I saw an old journal wedged behind a bunk. The leather cover was water-stained and cracked. Inside were entries dating back to 1973. The handwriting was tight and controlled. The captain, log, a man named Douglas Kent. I flipped through months of routine entries. Weather, catches, maintenance notes. Then I reached February of 74. The last entry was dated February 10th, the day before the storm hit. Kent had written about the ice forming early that year, about how the harbor was already starting to freeze over. And then, in the margins, in different ink, like he had added it later, the masts are crying. I can hear them from my house. The old-timers say it means the sea is angry, that it is going to take payment. I think they are right. I think something is coming. The next page was blank. Douglas Kent had been on one of the boats that went down. I showed Carl the log. He read it without expression, then handed it back. Keep it, he said. You are going to need to understand. I asked him what he meant. He looked out at the harbor, at the boats trapped in ice, at their masts cutting dark lines against the white sky. The crying is getting louder, he said. Thaw is coming early this year, maybe in a few days, and when the ice breaks, the boats are going to move. They always do. They drift to where the wrecks are, like they are trying to join them. That night, I went back to my rental room and researched everything I could find about the disaster. News articles, Coast Guard reports, survivor testimonies from the few boats that made it through. One detail kept appearing. Multiple survivors reported seeing lights on the water after the storm passed. Drifting lights where the boats had gone down. And they all described hearing sounds, voices calling for help, masts creaking in wind that was not there. The search and rescue teams found something else. When they recovered some of the bodies weeks later, the men's hands were frozen in strange positions, reaching upward, clutching at nothing, like they were trying to climb something that was not there. The official report called it a typical drowning response. But the divers who brought them up said different. They said the men looked like they were trying to climb the masts, trying to get higher, trying to get away from something in the water below them. The temperature started rising on day 9. I woke up to the sound of dripping. The ice on my window was melting. The air felt wrong, too warm for February in Alaska. 38 degrees. That might sound cold to you, but after weeks of below zero, it felt tropical. Dangerous. I got to the harbor at dawn. The crying was deafening. Every mast screaming now. The sound echoed off the frozen bay, multiplying, becoming something almost physical. I could see the ice. It was changing, going gray, soft spots appearing like bruises. The boats were starting to shift, just slightly, little movements, groans of metal and wood. After months of being locked solid, they were waking up. Carl was there, standing at the end of the main dock, staring out at the ice. Other locals had gathered too, silent, watching, waiting for something. I asked what they were doing. Carl did not look at me. Paying respects, he said. When the boats move, we watch. It is what we do. It is what we have always done. The first boat broke free around noon. The Starlight, a signer from the 70s. The ice around her hull cracked with sounds like gunshots. She drifted backward, slow and deliberate, like she was being pulled. No wind, no current strong enough to move her. But she moved anyway, drifted out into the bay, toward open water, toward the place where the map showed the wrecks lying on the bottom. Then the next boat went. And the next, 5 boats total, all of them old, all of them docked in Dillingham in 1974, all of them drifting in the same direction, trailing broken ice behind them like wedding veils. The crying stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. My ears rang with the absence of it. The boats continued drifting until they reached a point maybe half a mile out. Then they stopped, just sat there in the gray water, waiting. That is when I saw the lights. They appeared under the water, pale green, moving, rising from the deep, dozens of them. They clustered around the drifting boats, circling, pulsing. I grabbed binoculars from the harbormaster's office and looked closer. The lights were not mechanical. They were organic, bioluminescent, and they had shapes, human shapes, figures made of light, moving through the water like they were swimming, like they were climbing. The boats began to sink, not capsizing, not flooding, just settling straight down into the water, inch by inch, like something was pulling them from below. The masts stayed visible longest, sticking up from the water. And as they went under, I heard the crying again. One last wail, then silence. Carl was weeping. So were the other locals. They stood on the dock and watched their boats disappear, and they wept like they were watching a funeral. Because that is what it was. A funeral that happened every time the ice broke too early. Every time the thaw came unexpected. The sea taking its payment. The dead calling the boats home. I left Dillingham the next day. Took the first flight back to Anchorage. Then straight to Michigan. Did not collect my pay. Did not say goodbye. But here's what I cannot stop thinking about. Before I left, I went back to the Sea Ranger one last time. The boat was still in the harbor. Still frozen in place. It had not drifted with the others. In the cabin, I found another entry in Douglas Kent, this log. But I had read the whole thing. I knew this page had been blank. Now it was not. New handwriting. Recent. The ink was still wet. February 24th. The ice will break again in 7 days. The crying has already started. This time, the Sea Ranger will go. This time, I will be whole again. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them the sea never forgets. Tell them we are still here, still waiting, still calling for anyone who will listen. I looked at the date. It was dated today. I ran from that boat, from that harbor, from that town, but I keep checking the news, keep watching for reports from Dillingham. And 3 days ago, I saw it. A brief article about an unexpected thaw, about the Sea Ranger breaking free from the ice, about how she drifted out into the bay and disappeared. The harbor master said it was the strangest thing. The boat went down in calm water. Perfect conditions, like something pulled her under. They did not find wreckage. They did not find debris. She just went to the bottom, straight down, following the same path as the others. So here's what I need to know. If you heard the masts crying, if you saw boats moving on their own, if you knew something in the water was calling them home, would you stay? Would you try to understand? Would you go out on the ice when it started breaking, just to see what those lights really are? Or would you run, like I did, knowing that some debts never get paid, that some disasters never really end, that the dead sometimes refuse to let go? Write your answer in the comments, because I think about those lights every night, those human shapes made of bioluminescence. And I wonder if Douglas Kent is down there with the others. If they are all down there together, still climbing the masts, still trying to get higher, still trying to escape whatever is below them in the deep. And I wonder if the crying will ever stop, or if it will just keep echoing through every harbor where men have died, waiting for the next thaw, waiting to call the next boats home. Story 4. Rearranged books of Milne. I found a book on my desk that I had never checked out. That's where this all started. That simple, impossible fact. I am a librarian. I worked at the Milne Public Library for 11 years, and I know every volume in this building like I know the lines on my own hands. I know which books stick when you try to pull them from the shelf. I know which ones smell like mold from the 1970s. I know which ones have library stamps from 3 different decades on their inside covers. So when I came in on a Tuesday morning in February and found a thick hardcover sitting on my desk with its spine facing up, I knew something was wrong. The book was called The Lost Expedition of 1923, an account of the vanished gold miners of Nome. I had never seen it before. Nome, Alaska, is not a place that gets many visitors in winter. The population is around 3,500 people, depending on who's passing through, and by February, most of those people are just trying to survive the darkness and the cold. The sun doesn't rise in Nome in January. The sky stays deep blue and purple for weeks, and the temperature rarely climbs above 10 below zero. It's the kind of place where people develop theories about what happens to you when you live in perpetual darkness for that long. Madness, some say. Transformation. Others whisper. I had moved to Nome when I was 32 years old, fresh out of a failed relationship in Seattle and desperate to start fresh somewhere that felt far removed from the life I had built and destroyed. The library seemed perfect, remote, quiet, and full of books that nobody read. I could be alone with my thoughts and the written word, which felt like exactly what I needed at the time. I didn't. Do you know then that the library had secrets? The building itself is old, constructed in 1962, and it sits on the edge of town near the frozen Bering Sea. From the second floor windows, you can see the ice extending to the horizon like a white desert. The interior is typical for a small Alaskan library, understaffed, underfunded, with shelves that stretch into corners and areas that rarely get cleaned or organized. There's a section in the back left corner, on the second floor, that I had always found slightly unsettling. It housed the historical records, the Arctic expedition journals, the old mining logs, and the books about the gold rush era. The shelves there always felt colder than the rest of the building, even in summer. I had never understood why. I took the mysterious book downstairs to the circulation desk and ran it through our scanner. The system showed nothing. No checkout history, no date it entered the collection, no barcode records. As if the book had materialized on my desk without ever having been added to the library's inventory. I flipped through the pages. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and the typewriter text was faded but still readable. The book described an expedition of 19 gold miners who left Nome in March of 1923 to explore the far reaches of the Seward Peninsula. They were searching for a legendary mine that local Inuit hunters had spoken about for generations, a place where gold nuggets lay exposed on the surface of the earth like fallen fruit. The book detailed their supplies, their route, their equipment, and then it described what happened when they failed to return. The authorities searched for 6 months. They found nothing, no bodies, no equipment, no remains of camps or evidence of struggle. 19 men simply vanished into the Arctic landscape, and no one ever understood why. The book's author was listed as Sarah Whitmore, dated 1931, and in the acknowledgement section, she thanked the voices in the dark for their guidance. That was all. No explanation. No context. The rest of the book was detailed and straightforward, the writing clear and journalistic, but that single phrase about voices in the dark filled me with inexplicable dread. I shelved the book carefully, back in the Arctic expedition section on the second floor. I remember thinking, as I placed it on the shelf, that I should check our collection database later and figure out how it had entered the system without my knowledge. I never did. I forgot about it immediately. Or at least, I tried to. 3 days later, I found the same book on my desk again. This time, I was absolutely certain. I had shelved it myself. I knew exactly where I had placed it, between polar exploration and the advancement of science, and survival in the far north. I had even noted mentally that the spine was slightly cracked, and I had made a mental reminder to check if it needed repair. Now it was here, on my desk, exactly as it had been before, exactly where I had found it on that Tuesday morning. My hands were shaking as I carried it back to the second floor. The library was empty except for me. We rarely had patrons during the winter months. Most people had their reading materials already checked out and preferred to stay in their warm homes rather than venture out to the library. I was essentially alone in the building, and that fact suddenly felt significant. The Arctic expedition section was different. I stood in front of the shelves, my heart pounding, trying to process what I was seeing. The books had been rearranged, significantly rearranged. The organization was completely different from how I had left it. Books that had been on the top shelf were now on the bottom. Books that had been shelved chronologically were now arranged in some other order that I couldn't immediately identify. It was as if someone had carefully reorganized the entire section overnight, or during the few hours I had been away. I shelved the Whitmore book again, in the spot where it seemed to belong based on the new arrangement. Then I sat down at one of the tables in that section, my mind racing. Someone had been in the library. Someone had deliberately rearranged these books. But the doors were locked when I arrived. The alarm system showed no signs of tampering. And more than that, nobody in Nome would do something like this. We were all too isolated, too self-contained, too aware that we needed to maintain some basic level of civility and respect for shared resources. Unless it wasn't to someone. I left the library early that day. I told myself I was sick, which wasn't entirely untrue. I felt nauseated and dizzy, and my thoughts kept spiraling into territories I didn't want to explore. I went home to my small apartment above a hardware store on Front Street, made tea, and tried to read. I couldn't defocus. I kept thinking about the Whitmore book and those 19 vanished miners and that phrase about voices in the dark. That night, I heard whispering in my apartment walls. It was subtle at first, so quiet that I almost missed it. I was lying in bed around 11 o'clock when I noticed it, a sound like wind moving through a narrow space, but with a cadence that suggested language. I got out of bed and pressed my ear against the wall. The whispering grew slightly louder, and now I could make out individual words, though I didn't understand them. The language sounded ancient, guttural, nothing like English or the other languages I had studied. Inuit. The language was Inuit, or something close to it. I didn't know Inuit, but I knew what it sounded like. the particular way the words seemed to come from deep in the throat. I pressed my ear harder against the wall, trying to make out more. The whispering became more insistent, more urgent. I heard the words repeated several times, the same phrases over and over. Then, beneath the whispering, I heard something else, a sound like wind across snow, or perhaps water moving under ice. And underneath that, so faint I almost missed it, the sound of picks striking rock. The sound of mining. I pulled away from the wall and sat on my bed in the darkness of my apartment, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself it was the pipes. The building was old, and the pipes made strange sounds during the cold months. That was all. That was the rational explanation. But it wasn't the pipes. I knew it wasn't the pipes. The next morning, I returned to the library determined to find answers. I pulled the Whitmore book from its shelf and looked more carefully at the organizational pattern of the Arctic expedition section. I had been assuming it was random rearrangement, but now I studied it more methodically. The books seemed to be arranged not by chronology or author or subject, but by something else entirely. I traced the pattern, moving from shelf to shelf, and slowly, I realized what I was looking at. The spines of the books, when read in sequence, formed a map. The titles and authors created geographic references: Journey to the Eastern Seward Peninsula, Crossing the Kotzebue Sound, the northern route through the Arctic. When I followed them in order, they outlined a specific path from Milne eastward across the tundra, moving inland toward areas marked on old maps as unexplored territory. The final book in the sequence was the Whitmore book, and its description of the 1923 expedition ended with coordinates and a description of a location that wasn't marked on any modern map of the area. Someone, or something, had created a map out of my library books. Someone, or something, had rearranged them overnight to tell me exactly where the 19 miners had gone. I checked the Whitmore book out again, taking it to my desk to read more carefully. As I paged through it, I noticed something I had missed before. In the margins, in handwriting that was clearly different from the typed text, someone had written notes. Dozens of notes, in different hands, in different inks, all describing the same phenomenon. The miners had found the mine. They had found the legendary location with gold exposed on the surface. But when they tried to collect the gold, things changed. The first note, written in blue ink in what looked like very old handwriting, said they heard the singing after the first nugget was removed. The second note, in black ink, said the mine remembers the people who died here. The Inuit tell stories of a mass burial near this location, from a famine in 1887. The land is hungry. The third note, in pencil, said, the voices speak in Inuit, but no living Inuit speaker understands the dialect. It is older. It is the language of the dead. There were more notes, dozens of them, all describing variations of the same story. Each mining expedition that had tried to access the location of the lost mine experienced the same phenomenon. The earth seemed to resist them. The voices grew louder, and eventually, the miners either died or disappeared. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely keep the book open. I looked around the empty library, suddenly aware of how isolated I was, how far from help, how completely alone in this building with its walls and its darkness and its rearranged books that seemed determined to tell me a story I didn't want to hear. I heard the whispering again that night, louder than before. It was coming from the library. I could hear it even from my apartment, even through multiple walls and the winter wind. The whispers were more distinct now, more urgent. They were speaking in that old Inuit language, repeating the same phrases over and over. I understood nothing of the words, but I understood the meaning perfectly. The voices were calling me. They wanted me to come. The following morning, I received an email from Patricia Toomey, the harbor master's wife, who frequently volunteered at the library. She asked if I had reorganized the books in the Arctic section, because she had been looking for a specific book about Inuit traditions and found the entire section completely rearranged from how she remembered it. I told her no, I had just reorganized it myself the day before. I didn't, to tell her the truth. But the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. That night, I packed a bag. I decided I would take a leave of absence from the library. I would leave Nome and go back to Seattle, or anywhere else, anywhere away from this building and these books and these voices that were becoming louder and more insistent every single day. I booked a flight out for the following week. I told the library director I was having family issues and needed some time away. But before I left, I went back to the library one final time. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to find some kind of answer or explanation, no matter how impossible it seemed. The Arctic expedition section had been rearranged again. The books had moved once more, creating a new pattern. This time, the pattern was different. The spines no longer formed a map. Instead, they formed something else. Text. When I read the titles in sequence, they formed a message. The gold is ours, the message read. We died here. You took our gold. The land is hungry. Feed it or join us. The books ended with the Whitmore book. And when I pulled it from the shelf, I found a new page inserted inside the front cover. It was handwritten, in handwriting that I recognized. It was my handwriting, though I had never written on this page. The message read, come to the coordinates tomorrow at midnight. Bring gold, or we will come to you. And underneath, in letters that seemed to be formed from ice crystals or frost, was my name. I burned the book in my apartment that night. I also burned my employment contract, my records, and everything else from the library that I had brought home. I packed my bag and drove to the airport in the middle of the night, catching an emergency flight out of Nome without waiting for my scheduled departure. I have been living in Anchorage for 3 months now. I don't work in a library anymore. I can to go back to that work, but the whispers followed me here. I hear them in the walls of my apartment, speaking in that old Inuit language, calling my name in voices that sound like wind and grief and hunger. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a book, the Whitmore book, the same copy I had burned, completely restored, with a message on the front page now reading, you cannot escape. The voices are patient. We will wait. We will whisper. We will rearrange the books of every library you ever enter until you understand. The land remembers what was taken. Payment must be made. I am writing this now because I need people to understand what is happening in small communities like Nome. I need people to know that there are places where the boundaries between the living and the dead are so thin that they might as well not exist. There are places where the land itself seems to have memory and will and hunger. My question for you, the one I need answered in the comments, is this. Have you ever experienced something in a library or a bookstore that couldn't be explained? Have you ever noticed books rearranged in patterns that seemed almost intentional? Have you ever heard whispers speaking a language that sounded ancient and wrong? Because if you have, you should know that you are not alone. And you should understand that some messages are written not in words, but in the very structure of the shelves themselves. Some stories are told not by human authors, but by the dead, trying desperately to communicate across the distance between their world and ours. The question is, will you listen? And more importantly, will you understand what happens when you do? Story 5. Shadow plague. My shadow tried to kill me last March, and I need you to understand that I watched it happen. I moved to Pilot Station, Alaska in January of 2002 to work as a bush pilot. The pay was incredible, the isolation even better. After the mess in Seattle, after everything fell apart with my family and the bottle became my best friend, I needed somewhere to disappear. Pilot Station was perfect for that. Population 500 and something. No roads in or out, just the frozen Yukon River and endless white stretching to the horizon. The winter that year was brutal. Temperature stayed below zero for 63 straight days. The kind of cold that makes your lungs burn with each breath. The kind that turns moisture in your nose to ice crystals instantly. People stayed inside. Flights got canceled. The whole village seemed to hibernate, waiting for spring that felt like it would never come. I first noticed something wrong with the shadows in late February. I was walking from the airstrip to the general store, sun low on the horizon casting everything in that strange polar light. My shadow stretched out in front of me, dark and sharp against the snow. Normal, except it stopped moving when I did not. I had taken 3 more steps before I realized my shadow was still back where I had paused. Just standing there on the snow, waiting. I stopped, turned around, stared at it. The shadow stared back, a perfect silhouette of my body, but frozen in place 15 feet behind me. Then it moved, not with me, on its own. It shifted weight from one leg to another, tilted its head, raised one arm slowly, as if waving. I felt my stomach drop. I was not moving. My arms were at my sides, but my shadow was gesturing to me. I ran, did not think, just ran. When I looked back, my shadow was following, but wrong. It moved like it was learning how, like it was figuring out the mechanics of walking for the first time. Jerky, uneven, but fast, catching up. I made it to the store and burst through the door. The owner, Mary, looked up from behind the counter, asked if I was okay. I must have looked insane. But when I turned to point at my shadow through the window, it was back to normal. Connected to my feet, moving exactly as it should. Mary told me the cold does things to your head. Makes you see things that are not there. Cabin fever, isolation sickness. She had seen it before in newcomers. Told me to get some rest. Maybe cut back on the drinking. I wanted to believe her. Wanted to think it was just my mind playing tricks. But that night, lying in my rental cabin, I watched my shadow on the wall. The lamp beside my bed cast it there, dark and motionless. I did not move. Stayed perfectly still, just watched. After 10 minutes, the shadow sat up. I was still lying down, but my shadow on the wall sat upright, swung its legs over the side of the bed that was not there, and stood. It walked across the wall to the window, looked out at something I could not see. Then it turned its head back toward me. No features, no face, just a void in the shape of a person. But I knew it was looking at me. I slept with the lights off after that. The next morning, I heard the first reports. Other people in the village seeing the same thing. Shadows acting independently, moving on their own. At first, it was just odd behavior. Shadows lagging behind their owners by a few seconds. Shadows making gestures that did not match the person casting them. Strange, but not threatening. Then the shadows started gathering. I saw it myself 3 days later. I was doing a supply run, flying medicine to a village upriver. When I got back to pilot station and came in for landing, I saw them from the air. Dozens of shadows standing on the frozen river. No people, just shadows. They were arranged in a circle, all facing inward, perfectly still. The sun was at the wrong angle for them to be natural. There was nothing there to cast them. I landed and taxied to the hangar. By the time I got out of the plane, the shadows were gone. But I knew what I had seen, and from the faces of people on the airstrip, I knew I was not the only one. The village council called a meeting that night. Everyone packed into the community center. People were scared, confused, angry. Some thought it was a prank. Others blamed the government, chemicals in the water, some kind of radiation from old military sites. The elders sat in the back and said nothing, just watched with expressions I could not read. After the meeting, I caught one of the elders outside. His name was Paul. He had lived in pilot station his entire 78 years. I asked him straight out if he had ever seen anything like this before. He looked at me for a long time. Then he asked if I really wanted to know. We walked to his house. He made coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner for days. Then he told me about the winter of 1947. The last time it had gotten this cold for this long. The last time the shadows had separated. He said the old people, the ones who came before, believed shadows were not just absence of light. They were something else, a part of a person. Yes, but also separate, independent. Most of the time, they stayed connected, obedient. But during the longest, coldest winters, when the sun barely rose and darkness dominated, the shadows remembered what they used to be. They remembered they were not just reflections. They were originals. In 1947, the shadows had done the same thing. Moved on their own, gathered by the river, and then people started disappearing. One by one, always at night, always without a trace. The bodies were not found until spring thaw. All of them discovered in places the shadows had pointed to. Under the ice, buried in snowdrifts, hidden in places no one thought to look. Paul said 17 people vanished that winter. The disappearances stopped when the temperature rose and the sun returned. The shadows went back to normal. The survivors never talked about it. Tried to forget, but the elders remembered. They always remembered. I asked him what we were supposed to do. He said there was nothing to do except wait and watch our shadows. Because once they separated fully, once they broke free completely, they would come for their owners. The shadows were not evil, he said. They were just tired of being bound, tired of following. They wanted to be the ones in charge for once. I left his house and walked back to my cabin. The whole way, I felt my shadow pulling at me. Not physically, but like a weight, a presence. I could feel it behind me, attached to my feet, but straining, wanting to break free. That night, I taped newspaper over every window, covered every light source. I was not going to cast a shadow if I could help it. But in the darkness of my cabin, I heard something moving. Footsteps that were not mine. Breathing that came from the wrong direction. I sat in the corner with a flashlight, too terrified to turn it on, too terrified to stay in the dark. The disappearances started 4 days later. Sarah Bright, the school teacher, did not show up for work. Her house was empty, door unlocked, coffee still warm on the counter. No sign of struggle. No note, just gone. Search parties formed immediately. We looked everywhere. But Pilot Station is surrounded by thousands of miles of nothing. She could have been anywhere. Then we found the shadows, standing on the ice in their circle again. But this time, they were pointing. All of them. Arms extended, fingers aimed at a specific spot 200 yards downriver. We walked to where they indicated, took axes and broke through the ice, found Sarah 10 feet down, frozen solid, eyes open, expression peaceful, like she had walked out onto the ice and just let herself sink. 3 more people disappeared over the next week. Each time, the shadows gathered and pointed. Each time, we found the bodies exactly where they indicated. No signs of violence, no evidence of how they got there. They were just dead, like they had walked willingly to their own deaths. I stopped sleeping, stopped turning on lights. I lived in perpetual twilight in my cabin, curtains drawn, flashlight nearby but never used. I knew it was only a matter of time. The shadows were getting stronger, more independent. I would see mine sometimes in my peripheral vision, standing in corners where I was not, watching me from angles that should not exist. The village started falling apart. People stopped going outside, stopped trusting each other. Because how do you fight something that is literally a part of you? How do you escape your own shadow? I decided to leave, pack up and fly out before it was too late. I went to the hangar before dawn, thinking maybe in the dark I would be safe. Maybe without light, my shadow could not follow. But when I opened the hangar door, I saw them. Every shadow in Pilot Station was inside. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, standing in rows, waiting. They did not move when I entered, did not react, just stood there like an army at attention. And at the front of them all was mine. I recognized it by the way it stood, the slight slouch in the shoulders, the way it held its hands. It stepped forward, the others remained still. My shadow approached me slowly. I could not move, could not run. It was like being frozen, paralyzed by fear so complete it shut down every muscle in my body. My shadow stopped 3 feet away. Then it did something I did not expect. It reached out, not to hurt me, to touch. Its hand, solid somehow despite being made of nothing but darkness, pressed against my chest. And I felt it, cold, so cold it burned. The cold seeped into me, through my jacket, through my skin, straight into my heart. Images flooded my mind. Not thoughts, not memories, knowledge, understanding. The shadows were not trying to kill us. They were trying to show us something. The people who had disappeared, the ones we found frozen under the ice, they had not been murdered. They had volunteered. They had seen what their shadows showed them and they had chosen. The shadows were offering a trade. They were tired of being less than, of being secondary. They wanted to be real, to have substance, to exist in the light. And they needed bodies to do it. Our bodies. They were not taking them by force. They were asking, showing us what it felt like to be them, to be trapped in 2 dimensions, to be dependent on light and position and the whims of others. They were asking if we would trade places. I saw through my shadow. His eyes, felt what it felt, the longing, the isolation, the desperate desire to be more than a reflection. And I understood why those people had walked onto the ice, why they had let the cold take them. Because in exchange, their shadows became real, stepped out of darkness and into life, took their place in the world while they retreated into the flat, silent existence their shadows had endured for so long. My shadow, his hand pulled away. The cold retreated. I could move again. It stood there, waiting, offering, asking without words if I wanted to trade, if I wanted to become the shadow while it became me. I ran, broke whatever hold it had and ran out of that hangar into the pre-dawn darkness. I did not go back to my cabin. I went straight to Paul, his house, and pounded on his door until he answered. I told him everything I had seen and felt and understood. He nodded like he already knew. He said the same thing had happened in 47. The shadows had offered the same trade. Some people had accepted, most had not. The ones who refused, their shadows eventually gave up, went back to normal when spring came. But the ones who accepted, they were gone forever, trapped in shadow form while their bodies walked around with something else inside. He told me I had to make a choice. Everyone in Pilot Station did. Accept the trade and become something else, or refuse and hope the shadows gave up eventually. But he warned me, the shadows remembered. Even if they went dormant again, even if they seemed normal, they always remembered. And they would always be waiting for the next long winter, the next chance to break free. I chose to refuse, to stay myself, to keep my body and accept that my shadow would always be a separate thing, a trapped thing, waiting for its opportunity. I thought I could live with that. Thought I could handle knowing what I knew. But here's what Paul did not tell me. Here's what I found out too late. The shadows that did not get accepted, the ones whose owners refused to trade, they became angry, resentful. They did not go back to being passive reflections. They became something else, something worse. My shadow has been trying to kill me for 3 weeks now. Not offering anymore, not asking. It waits until I am vulnerable, until I am tired or distracted or in a dangerous situation. Then it acts. It moves wrong, makes me trip when I am near edges, positions itself to block my vision at crucial moments. 2 days ago, I nearly fell through weak ice because my shadow shifted position, making me misjudge where I was stepping. I am not the only one. Half the village is dealing with the same thing. Shadows that have turned hostile. Shadows that are patient and clever and know exactly how to hurt their owners without leaving evidence. The people who accepted the trade are fine. Their shadows are living their lives while they exist in peace in the flat world of darkness. But those of us who refused are being hunted by parts of ourselves that hate us. I am writing this because I need to warn people. If your shadow ever moves on its own, if it ever separates from you even for a second, do not ignore it. It means something has changed. Something fundamental about the relationship between light and dark, between self and reflection, has broken. And once it breaks, you have to make a choice. Trade or fight. There is no middle ground. I do not know how much longer I can keep fighting. My shadow is patient. It knows me better than I know myself. Knows every weakness, every fear, every moment when my guard will be down. And it only has to win once. So let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed your shadow acting strange? Moving a fraction of a second too slow or too fast? Have you ever felt watched by something that has no eyes? Have you ever wondered what your shadow thinks about? What it wants? What it would do if it could break free? Write your answer in the comments. Because I need to know if this is spreading. If the shadows are waking up in other places. If there are others out there fighting the same war against themselves. Because my shadow is getting stronger. And I am getting tired. And I do not know if I will survive the next winter. Story 6. Frozen Records. The medical file was written in ice. Have you ever touched something that shouldn't to exist? Something that feels real under your fingers but breaks every law of nature you thought you understood? I am a doctor. 56 years old. Been practicing rural medicine for 28 years. I've set broken bones in hunting camps 50 miles from the nearest road. I've delivered babies by lantern light during blizzards. I've diagnosed illnesses that textbooks said were extinct. But nothing in my training prepared me for the files I found in the basement of Bethel Clinic. Files written in frozen water that knew things they couldn't possibly know. It started 3 weeks ago. The clinic needed more storage space, so my nurse Jenny and I went down to clear out the old records room. The basement was exactly what you'd expect. Concrete walls, flickering fluorescent lights, boxes of paperwork dating back to the 60s stacked on metal shelves. Cold. Always cold down there, even with the heating system running full blast. We were about an hour in when Jenny found the filing cabinet. Old steel, 4 drawers, covered in frost that shouldn't to have been there because the basement was heated. The frost formed patterns across the metal surface, delicate, geometric, like something had deliberately arranged it into shapes that almost looked like words. I told Jenny to leave it. Something about that cabinet felt wrong. The way the frost caught the light, the way the metal seemed colder than the surrounding air, the way my breath fogged heavier when I stood near it. But Jenny was practical, a problem solver. She grabbed a scraper and started chipping away the frost. The moment she touched the handle, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Not gradually, instantly. Our breath turned to clouds so thick we could barely see each other. The lights flickered, and from inside the cabinet came a sound like wind through ice caves. Like something breathing, something old and patient and awake. Jenny pulled open the top drawer. Inside were medical files, dozens of them, but they weren't tea paper. They were ice, thin sheets of crystallized water suspended in the drawer like pages in a book. And written on them, in perfect detail, were patient records. Names, dates, symptoms, diagnoses, treatment plans, all of it frozen into the ice in text so clear it looked printed. So precise it looked impossible. I reached for the first file. The ice was cold enough to burn, cold enough to stick to my skin like I touched a frozen pole. But I pulled it out anyway and held it up to the light. The patient's name was Sarah Mitchell. Date of admission, November 14th, 1968. Chief complaint, unexplained fatigue, recurring nightmares, sensation of being watched. The symptoms were listed in clinical detail. The treatment plan was standard for the era. Anxiety medication, therapy referrals, Nothing unusual, except Sarah Mitchell was currently in our waiting room upstairs. I'd seen her that morning. 52 years old, complaining of unexplained fatigue, recurring nightmares, sensation of being watched. The exact same symptoms from a file written 57 years ago about a patient who would have been negative 5 years old in 1968. The ice began to melt in my hands. Not from my body heat, from something internal. The water ran between my fingers, and I caught the smell immediately. Antiseptic, sharp and chemical, but underneath it something else. Something organic and metallic. Old blood, the kind of smell that comes from wounds that didn't heal right. From surgeries that went wrong. From medical procedures performed in desperation. The text dissolved as the ice melted. The words ran together, became illegible. Within 30 seconds, the file was just water dripping onto the concrete floor. Water that smelled like a hospital from another era. Like pain and fear in something that had been frozen for decades but was finally thawing. Jenny pulled out another file, then another. Each one was written on ice. Each one described a current patient with symptoms that matched perfectly. David Torres, Margaret Chen, James Whitmore. All of them people I'd be treated in the last month. All of them documented in files from 1968. All of them described with accuracy that shouldn't be possible. The dates were all from November 1968. A 2-week period, 15 patients admitted with various complaints. But the symptoms had patterns. They all reported nightmares. All felt watched. All complained of cold that wouldn't go away no matter how many layers they wore. And all of them, according to the frozen records, had died within a week of admission. Cause of death was listed as exposure. Every single one, like they defrozen to death despite being inside heated buildings. Like the cold had gotten into them somehow and worked from the inside out, turning their organs to ice, their blood to slush, their thoughts to frozen fragments that couldn't quite connect. But these people were alive, walking around Bethel, coming to my clinic, living normal lives. How could they be dead? How could files from 1968 describe patients from 2025 who supposedly died 57 years ago? I went back upstairs and pulled Sarah Mitchell's current medical record. Compared it to the frozen file before it had completely melted. The handwriting matched. The specific details matched. Even the wording of her complaints matched word for word. Like she'd been scripted. Like she'd been reading from frozen text that had been waiting underground for half a century. I called her into my office. Asked her about her symptoms. About her nightmares. She described them in detail. Dreams of drowning in black water. Dreams of being buried in snow. Dreams where she couldn't tell if she was awake or asleep. Where the world felt thin somehow. Like reality was just a surface she might break through if she pushed too hard. Then I asked her something I shouldn't have. Asked if she remembered 1968. If she'd been to Bethel Clinic before. If anything from that year felt familiar. Her face went blank. Completely empty. Like I asked a question her programming couldn't answer. She sat there for 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Staring at nothing. Not breathing. Not blinking. Just frozen in place like her mind had hit some kind of barrier it couldn't cross. When she came back, she didn't remember the question. Didn't remember the pause. Just smiled and asked when her next appointment should be. I went back to the basement that night. Alone. I needed to see those files again. Needed to understand what I found. The filing cabinet was still there. Still covered in frost. But the patterns had changed. The geometric shapes had rearranged themselves into something new. Something that looked almost like a map. Like directions. Leading deeper into the basement. To places I didn't existed. I followed the frost patterns. They led me past the old storage room to a door I never noticed before. Heavy steel. No handle. No lock. Just a door that shouldn't open. But when I pushed it, the steel swung inward easily. Silently. Like it had been waiting for me. The room beyond was impossible. Larger than the footprint of the building above it. Filled with hospital beds. Dozens of them. All occupied. Patients lying perfectly still under white sheets. Hooked up to machines that hummed with power despite not being plugged into anything. Monitors showing vital signs that were wrong. Heart rates too slow. Body temperatures too low. Brain activity that pulsed in patterns that looked more like frost formations than neural activity. I recognized them. All of them. Current patients. People I'd seen in the last month. Sarah Mitchell in bed 7. David Torres in bed 12. Margaret Chen in bed 23. All of them lying here in the impossible room while their duplicates walked around Bethel living normal lives. But these weren't the duplicates. These were the originals, the real patients, the ones who They'd been admitted in November 1968 and never left. The ones who frozen from the inside out and stayed frozen for 57 years. Preserved in some pocket of cold that existed outside normal time, outside normal space, a room that only appeared during certain temperatures, certain alignments, certain moments when the world got thin enough for something old to push through. The patients upstairs were echoes, reflections, copies made from frozen memories and sent out to live the lives these people should have lived if they hadn't died in 1968. If the cold hadn't taken them, if something in the Arctic darkness hadn't decided to preserve them, study them, keep them in suspended animation while their frozen consciousness generated duplicates who could move through the world and report back everything they experienced. I approached Sarah Mitchell's bed. Her skin was pale, blue-tinged, covered in frost that grew and receded with her breathing. She was alive, technically, but not in any way that mattered. Her body was a shell, a frozen battery powering the echo that walked around pretending to be human. That came to my clinic with scripted complaints. That asked scripted questions. That lived a scripted life while the real Sarah lay here in the dark, dreaming frozen dreams. A hand grabbed my shoulder. Cold, impossibly cold. I spun around. Jenny stood behind me. But not Jenny. This was the frozen version, the original. The one who had been here since 1968 when she first come to Bethel Clinic with the same symptoms as everyone else. When she died like everyone else. When she been preserved like everyone else. Her mouth moved. No sound came out. But I understood anyway. Understood what she was trying to tell me. What all of them were trying to tell me. They didn't want to be here. Didn't want to be frozen. Didn't want to spend eternity in this impossible room generating echoes who lived their lives for them. But they couldn't leave. Couldn't die properly because something needed them. Something that fed on the cold and the isolation and the desperate loneliness of people trapped between life and death. I ran, didn't look back, didn't stop until I was upstairs in my office with the door locked and every light on. I could hear them below, all 15 frozen patients, breathing in unison, exhaling frost that rose through the floorboards. That lowered the temperature degree by degree. That reminded me they were still there, still aware, still trapped. The next morning, Sarah Mitchell came for her appointment. Smiled like nothing was wrong. Complained about the same symptoms. I prescribed the same medication. Told her to come back in 2 weeks. She thanked me and left. And I watched her go knowing she wasn't real. Knowing the real Sarah was downstairs in the frozen room. Knowing I couldn't tell her. Couldn't tell anyone. Because who would believe me? Who would understand that our patients are echoes? That Bethel Clinic has been treating the duplicates of people who died in 1968? That somewhere beneath our feet, 15 frozen bodies lie in impossible beds, dreaming frozen dreams that generate walking shadows? I went back to the basement last night. The door was gone. Just a blank wall where it had been. The filing cabinet was empty. All the frozen files had melted. All that remained was water on the concrete floor. Water that smelled like antiseptic and old blood. Water that spelled out words in melted letters before evaporating. Words that said the same thing over and over. Release us. Help us. End this. But I can, because I Don. Do you know how? Don, do you know what would happen if I unplugged those machines? Don, do you know if the echoes upstairs would disappear? Don, do you know if the frozen patients would finally die? Don, do you know if the cold would spread? Consume the building. Consume the town. Turn all of us into frozen batteries generating duplicates who live scripted lives while our real bodies lie in impossible rooms dreaming impossible dreams. So I keep seeing patients. Keep treating echoes. Keep pretending everything is normal. And every time someone comes in with unexplained fatigue and recurring nightmares and the sensation of being watched, I wonder if they renew, or if they've been here since 1968. If somewhere beneath my feet, another bed holds another frozen body. Another dreamer generating another shadow. The cold is spreading. I can feel it. Each week the basement gets colder. Each week more frost forms on the walls. Each week the impossible room gets larger. Adding beds. Adding patients, adding echoes to the world above while the originals sleep below. So here's what I need to know. Have you been to a doctor lately? Have you complained about fatigue you can explain? About nightmares that feel too real? About the sensation that someone is watching you even when you alone? And have you felt cold? Deep cold that want to go away no matter what you do? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know how far it is spread. How many clinics have basement rooms that shouldn't to exist? How many patients are really echoes? How many of us are walking around living scripted lives while our frozen bodies lie somewhere dark, dreaming the dreams that keep us moving? That keep us seeming real. That keep us from realizing we died years ago and everything since has been just frost and memory and cold. Tell me before you check your medical records and find files written in ice. Before you realize your symptoms match someone from 1968. Before you understand that you read not the original. You read the echo. And somewhere beneath the ground, you read still frozen, still dreaming, still waiting to wake up. Story 7. Night watchman of Alaska. The figure on the security camera was carrying a lantern that should not exist anymore. And when I zoomed in on his face, I recognized a dead man. Not just dead, gone for 72 years. But there he was, making his rounds through the abandoned cannery like it was still 1952 and his shift had never ended. I took the security contract for the old Unalaska cannery in November. Easy money, they said. Just monitor the cameras from home. Make sure nobody breaks in to steal copper wire or vandalize the place. The cannery had been shut down since 2003, sitting empty on the edge of town, slowly rusting into the tundra. 4 massive buildings connected by covered walkways. Processing equipment left to rot. Office furniture gathering dust. The kind of place that developers keep meaning to tear down but never quite get around to. The company that owned it installed cameras everywhere after some kids broke in and started a fire. 12 cameras total, covering every entrance, every main corridor, every loading dock. They fed directly to an app on my phone. All I had to do was watch for movement and call the police if I saw anything suspicious. $200 a week to sit in my apartment and occasionally glance at my screen. I thought it was the easiest job I would ever have. The first alert came at 2:17 in the morning on my third night. Motion detected in building C. I pulled up the feed on my phone, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe the wind blowing something past the sensor. Instead, I saw him. A man walking down the corridor. Slowly, methodically. He wore coveralls and a heavy coat, the kind workers used in the 40s and 50s before modern cold weather gear. In his right hand, he carried an old-fashioned kerosene lantern. Not a flashlight, not a headlamp, an actual lantern with a glass chimney and a flame that cast dancing shadows on the walls. He moved like someone on patrol, checking doors, peering into rooms, making sure everything was secure. I watched him for 3 minutes. He never looked at the camera, never acknowledged that he was being recorded. He just walked his route, turned a corner, and disappeared from view. I switched to the next camera in sequence. Nothing. He should have appeared in frame within seconds, but the corridor was empty. I cycled through every camera in buildings and no sign of him. He had vanished. I checked the recording. The footage was there, clear as day. A man with a lantern walking through an abandoned building at 2 in the morning. I could see his face in the lantern light, weathered, maybe 60 years old, strong jaw, deep-set eyes, and something about his expression that made my stomach tighten. He looked focused, intent, like he was searching for something he had lost. The next morning, I called my contact at the property management company. A woman named Diane who handled the contract. I told her about the footage. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me to send her the video file. I did. 10 minutes later, she called back. Her voice was different, strained. She told me to come to her office that afternoon. She wanted me to meet someone. The someone was an old man named Frank Ivanov, 89 years old, bent with age but still sharp-eyed. He had worked at the cannery from 1947 to 1996. 49 years gutting fish and running machinery. Diane showed him the video on her computer. I watched his face as he watched the screen. Watched the color drain from his cheeks. Watched his hands start to shake. "That is Henry Volkov," Frank said. His voice was barely a whisper. Henry was the night watchman. Started in 1946. Good man. Dedicated. Never missed a shift. He disappeared during the big storm in January of '52. We figured he went outside to check something and got lost in the whiteout. They searched for weeks. Never found his body. Never found any trace of him. Frank looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. He has been there ever since. On the cameras, making his rounds. We see him every winter. Always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Always carrying that same lantern. Always checking the doors like he is still responsible for the place. I asked why nobody had told me. Frank shrugged. Most security people quit after they see him. The ones who stay learn to ignore it. Henry does not cause trouble. He just walks, over and over, trying to finish his shift. Trying to make sure everything is locked up safe before he goes home. Except he never makes it home. He just resets at some point and starts his rounds again. That night, I watched the cameras with new eyes. Henry appeared at 2:23. Same route, same lantern, same methodical checking of doors and windows. I started timing him. His patrol took exactly 47 minutes. At the end, he would walk toward the loading dock exit, reach for the door handle, and then simply fade out. Not disappear instantly, fade, like an old photograph left in the sun. Within seconds, he would be completely gone. Then, the next night, he would start again from the same point in buildings that I became obsessed with him. I started researching the storm of January 1952. It had been a freak weather event. Temperature dropped to 40 below. Wind speeds exceeded 90 miles per hour. Whiteout conditions lasted for 36 hours. 3 people in Alaska died that night. Henry Volkov was one of them. But unlike the others, his body was never recovered. The newspaper archives from February 52 had a small article about the search. It mentioned that Henry had been making his usual rounds when the storm hit. His wife reported him missing when he did not come home at 6 a.m. They found his lunch pail in the guard shack, his thermos of coffee still warm. His logbook open to his last entry, written at 1:57 a.m. Everything secure. Beginning rounds. Back at 4. He had never made it back. I started staying up to watch him every night. The footage was always the same. Same route, same timing, same fade at the end. But then, 2 weeks into my contract, something changed. Henry stopped at a door I had never seen him check before. A door marked boiler room. He stood in front of it for a long time. His free hand reached out, touched the handle, then pulled back. He looked directly at the camera. The first time he had ever acknowledged its presence. His mouth moved. He was trying to say something. I could not hear it. The cameras had no audio, but I could read his lips. Help me. Then he turned and continued his rounds like nothing had happened. I went to the cannery the next day. First time I had actually entered the building. The property management company had given me keys for emergencies. I found buildings. I found the corridor I had seen Henry walk 100 times. The air inside was freezing, colder than outside. My breath misted in thick clouds. The floor was covered in frost despite the fact that the building was theoretically insulated. I followed his route, every door he checked, every window he peered through. It took me to the boiler room. The door was locked, not with a regular lock, a heavy padlock, old, rusted. I could see where someone had welded it shut at some point. The metal around it was corroded and pitted. I called Frank, asked him about the boiler room. He was quiet. Then he told me a story he said he had never told anyone outside the cannery workers. The night Henry disappeared, there had been a problem. One of the storage rooms had flooded. Salt water from the bay had somehow gotten into the basement through a crack in the foundation. Henry had gone down to investigate, to see if it could wait until morning or if they needed to pump it out immediately. That was the last time anyone saw him. The workers who came in the next morning found the basement flooded to a depth of 3 feet. Freezing salt water. They pumped it out. Found nothing. No body. No evidence that Henry had ever been down there. But here's the thing Frank said they never reported. When they pumped out the water, they found his lantern. Still lit, sitting on a shelf above the waterline. Like he had put it down carefully, planning to come back for it. And next to the lantern, written in frost on the wall, were words. Help trapped in boiler. They checked the boiler room. It was dry, empty. The door was locked from the outside. Henry could not have been in there. But the message was clear. The workers were spooked. They welded the door shut, told the company the boiler was damaged beyond repair and sealed it for safety reasons. Nobody went in there again. I went back to the cannery that night with bolt cutters. I do not know why. Compulsion. Some sense that I owed Henry something. That 72 years was long enough to walk the same 47-minute route trying to finish a shift that had gone wrong. The padlock was old but solid. It took me 20 minutes to cut through it. The door opened with a scream of rusted hinges. Cold air poured out. Not just cold, Arctic cold, the kind that burns your lungs. I clicked on my flashlight and looked inside. The boiler room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12. The old boiler dominated the space, a massive iron cylinder covered in frost. And in front of it, frozen into the floor in a layer of ice, was a lunch pail, a thermos, and a single boot. I stepped closer. The ice was at least 6 inches thick, perfectly clear, and trapped in it, I could see other things. Clothing, a belt, a watch, and bones. Human bones. Not a complete skeleton, just fragments, scattered, like something had torn the body apart. Behind me, the door slammed shut. The temperature plummeted. My flashlight flickered, and in the beam, I saw him. Henry Volkov. Not the faded image from the camera. Real, solid. He stood between me and the door. his lantern casting shadows that moved wrong, that reached toward me like fingers. His mouth opened. His voice was the sound of wind through ice. I fell, went through, under the floor, under the ice, tried to get out. Cold, so cold. Could not move, could not breathe. Waited for help. Kept waiting. Nobody came. Walked for help. Walked and walked. Never stopped walking. Cannot stop. I understood then. The flood had not been just water. It had been a rupture. A break in the permafrost beneath the cannery. Henry had fallen through, into a pocket of freezing water and ice below the foundation. He had tried to get out. Had climbed. Had reached the boiler room. But by then, he was already dying. Already freezing. His body had broken down in the cold. The water above him had frozen solid, trapping what remained. And his spirit had kept walking, kept trying to finish his rounds, kept trying to get home. For 72 years. I am sorry, I said. The words felt inadequate, useless. Henry looked at me, really looked at me. His expression changed. The desperate intensity faded. Something like relief crossed his face. Then he pointed to the floor, to the ice, to his own remains frozen below. I called the police the next morning. Told them I had found human remains while doing a security check. They came. They cut through the ice. They recovered what was left of Henry Volkov. The medical examiner confirmed the identity through dental records. His wife had been dead since 1984, but he had 3 grandchildren still living in Alaska. They gave him a proper burial, put a stone with his name and dates in the cemetery overlooking the bay. That night, I watched the cameras. 217 came and went. No alert, no movement. Henry did not appear. I cycled through every feed, every angle. The cannery was empty, silent, just buildings full of rust and shadows. He had made it home. But here's what I cannot stop thinking about. 3 nights ago, I got a motion alert. Different building, different time, 4:37 a.m. I pulled up the feed and saw a different figure. A woman this time, younger, wearing a hairnet and an apron from maybe the 1960s. She was walking through the processing area, looking around, searching. I called Frank, described her. He knew immediately. That is Mary Chan, he said. She worked the canning line, disappeared in '69, fell into one of the processing tanks. The machinery had malfunctioned. They shut everything down, drained the tanks, never found her body, just her shoes. So here's my question. How many of them are still there? How many people disappeared in that cannery over the decades? How many are still walking? Still searching? Still trying to get home? And if you were me, if you saw them on the cameras night after night, would you help them? Would you find their remains and give them peace? Or would you walk away and let them keep walking forever? Write your answer in the comments, because I am still watching those cameras. And every week, I see someone new, someone lost, someone trapped, and I do not know if I can save them all. I do not know if I should even try, but I cannot stop watching, cannot stop looking for them in the shadows and the frost, cannot stop wondering how long they have been walking, and how much longer they will have to walk before someone finally brings them home. Story 8. Breathing room. I need to tell you something about the winter I spent in Teller, Alaska. Something that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning, gasping for air that feels too warm, too alive. Because once you've heard what breathes in the cold, you will never trust silence again. Have you ever wondered what happens to the dead when nobody is watching? I used to be a morgue attendant. Not glamorous, I know, but the pay was decent and the work was straightforward. Keep the bodies cold, keep the paperwork organized, keep your mouth shut. 3 simple rules that worked just fine for 15 years in Seattle. Then my marriage fell apart. My daughter stopped returning my calls. And I found myself scrolling through job listings at 2 in the morning with a bottle of whiskey that was winning the argument about whether I had a drinking problem. That's when I saw the posting. Teller, Alaska, population 400, morgue attendant needed immediately, housing included, salary that made my eyes water. I should have asked myself why they were so desperate. Why they pay a 62-year-old burnout twice the going rate to babysit corpses in a town where the sun disappears for months at a time. But I didn't ask. I just clicked apply and tried to remember what hope felt like. I arrived in Teller on a Tuesday in November. The kind of cold that hits you like a physical thing, like walking into a wall made of knives. The town was smaller than I imagined. A handful of buildings clustered together like frightened animals, surrounded by endless white nothing. The sky was the color of old bruises, and the wind carried sounds that didn't seem to come from any direction at all. The morgue sat at the edge of town, a low concrete building that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated architecture. My supervisor was a woman named Chen, maybe 40, with eyes that had seen too much and a handshake like frozen steel. She showed me around without saying much. The facility was newer than I expected. Clean, well-equipped, state-of-the-art cooling systems that hummed with an efficiency that seemed almost excessive for a town this size. Why is everything so new? I asked, running my hand along pristine stainless steel. Chen stopped walking. Didn't he turn around? Previous facility had issues. This one is better. She showed me the storage units. 8 of them. Only 2 were occupied. An elderly man who died of a heart attack. A hunter who got lost in a storm. Standard stuff. Nothing that should have made Chen this jaw tighten the way it did when she looked at them. You will do the night checks, she said. Every 2 hours. Temperature logs. Visual confirmation. Nothing complicated. Visual confirmation of what? She finally looked at me then. Really looked at me. That they were still dead. I laughed. She didn't. My first week passed without incident. The work was easy. Boring. Even. I did make my rounds. Check the temperatures. Fill out the logs. Then spend the rest of my shift reading paperback thrillers in the break room. The heating system rattled sometimes, and the building settled in ways that sounded almost like footsteps. But I worked in old buildings before. They all have their sounds, their personalities. This one just happened to be in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness that pressed against the windows like something alive. The first body arrived during a blizzard. I was on my 3rd cup of coffee, watching the wind tear at the world outside, when the emergency entrance buzzer went off. I opened the reinforced door to find 2 state troopers carrying a stretcher, their faces hidden behind ice-crusted masks. The body bag between them was covered in snow that had already frozen into geometric patterns, crystals growing in formations that looked almost deliberate. Ice climber, one of them shouted over the wind, fell near the glacier. Been out there 3 days. They brought him in, and I started the intake process. Male, mid-30s, ID said his name was Marcus Webb from Colorado. When I unzipped the bag, I had to look away. The cold had done things to him. His skin was the color of old newspaper, and frost had formed in his hair. His eyelashes, spreading across his features in delicate patterns that looked like lace. Like something beautiful and terrible had been growing on him. I got him logged, tagged, and into storage unit 5. Locked it, did my paperwork. By the time I finished, the troopers were long gone, and the storm had gotten worse. The wind didn't sound like wind anymore. It sounded like breathing, deep, slow breaths that rattled the walls and made the lights flicker. At midnight, I did my rounds. Everything normal. At 2, the same. At 4, I stopped outside storage unit 5. The temperature display was wrong. It should have read 36 degrees. Instead, it showed 38. A small difference. Meaningless, probably. Except the unit's compressor was running harder than it should, working overtime, and I could hear something else beneath the mechanical hum. Something rhythmic. Something that sounded almost like. I opened the viewing window. Marcus Webb, his eyes were open. I dropped my clipboard. The crash echoed through the empty building, but I barely heard it over the sound of my own heartbeat. I pressed my face against the window, hands shaking. His eyes were definitely open, wide, staring at the ceiling of the storage unit with an intensity that made my stomach turn. But he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. Of course he wasn't breathing. He was dead, 3 days dead, frozen solid. I watched him for 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours. He never blinked, never moved, just stared at nothing with eyes that shouldn't have been opened because I closed them myself during intake. I filled out an incident report, wrote it off as body positioning, post-mortem muscle relaxation, something medical that I didn't fully understand but that had to have an explanation. Then I went back to the break room and drank coffee until the shaking stopped. At 6 a.m., I did my final round before Chen arrived. Storage unit 5 showed 39 degrees. The body had moved. Not much, just enough that his head was turned slightly toward the door, toward the viewing window, toward me. His hands, which had been flat at his sides, were now slightly raised, fingers curved like he was reaching for something. And his chest, his frozen chest, had a thin layer of new frost across it. Fresh frost, growing in real time, spreading across his skin in patterns that looked like breathing clouds, like condensation from warm breath hitting cold air. I didn't file a report this time. I called Chen. She arrived within 20 minutes, which meant she'd been awake. Waiting. She went straight to Unit 5 without saying a word to me. Looked through the viewing window for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, professional, completely empty of surprise. Did you open the unit? No, just look through the window. Good, Don, to open it. Not until after the storm passes. Chen, what is happening? She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had been trying not to see since I arrived. Fear, the deep kind, the kind that comes from experience. The cold does things here, she said, especially during storms, especially to bodies that spent time out in it. We don't fully understand it. Hell, I don't think we're supposed to. But there are rules, Don, to open the units during a storm. Don, to go near them after midnight. And for God, sake, never leave them alone in the dark. You retelling me he was moving in there? That dead bodies just get up and walk around? No, they don't. To walk. They breathe. She left me then, told me to finish my shift like normal and not to think about it too hard. As if that was possible. As if I could just ignore the fact that something impossible was happening 30 feet away from where I was standing. The storm lasted 3 more days. During that time, Marcus Webb's temperature rose to 42 degrees despite the unit working at maximum capacity. The frost patterns on his chest became elaborate, fractal, spreading up his neck and across his face in designs that looked less like ice and more like something trying to communicate. And every time I checked the viewing window, he moved. Never when I was watching, only between checks, inch by inch, degree by degree, turning toward the door like he was trying to find a way out. On the second night, I heard the breathing, not from the unit, from the walls, deep, slow inhalations that made the building creak and settle, exhalations that sent waves of cold air through the vents, dropping the temperature in the break room by 10 degrees in 30 seconds. I sat there, wrapped in my coat, listening to something massive breathing all around me. Something that lived in the cold and woke up during storms. Something that Marcus Webb had met out there on the glacier, and that had followed him back. The other body, the elderly man from my first week, started showing the same signs. Temperature rising, frost patterns forming, eyes opening between rounds. Chen stopped coming to work. Just sent me text messages. Short instructions. Keep the units closed. Keep the logs. Don, to investigate. Don, to think about it. But how could I not think about it? How could I sit there in that break room, drinking coffee that tasted like fear, knowing that 30 feet away, 2 dead men were sitting up in the dark, breathing clouds of frozen air, growing colder on the outside while something inside them warmed up? Something that shouldn't be there. Something that the cold had put there. On the third night, the hunter's body disappeared. I did my round at midnight. He was there, eyes open, head turned toward the door, fresh frost spreading across his chest in patterns that looked like reaching hands. At 2 a.m., the storage unit was empty. Doors still locked. No signs of forced entry. Just gone. The frost patterns remained, though, spread across the empty gurney in the exact shape of a man. A man who had been lying there breathing frozen air into existence. I called Chen. She didn't answer. I called the state troopers. They said they sent someone when the storm cleared. I called the town. His only doctor, an old man named Patterson who I had met once at the general store. He laughed. Not a happy laugh. A bitter, knowing laugh. You work at the morgue, he said. You finally seeing it. Seeing what? Why the last 3 attendants quit. Why we built a new facility. Why we pay so much for someone willing to work nights during storm season. He paused. The line crackled with static and something else. Something that sounded like breathing. The cold here is old. Older than the town. Older than the ice. And it doesn't like being disturbed. Every winter, people die out there. In the snow. In the dark. And when we bring them back, when we try to warm them up, to process them like regular corpses, the cold comes with them. It lives in them, uses them to breathe. That is insane. Is it? You've seen it. You've heard it. The breathing in the walls. The bodies that move when you're not looking. The frost that grows despite the heating. That is not decay. That is not science. That is the cold trying to get out, trying to spread. He hung up before I could respond. I should have left, should have walked out that door and never looked back. But I didn't. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the same stubborn stupidity that had kept me in a failing marriage for 10 years. Maybe I just needed to know. Needed to understand what I was dealing with. So instead of leaving, I went back to storage unit 5. Marcus Webb was sitting up. Not lying down. not slightly raised, sitting, fully vertical, hands resting on his knees, head turned directly toward the viewing window. Looking at me, his eyes had changed. They weren't dead anymore. They weren't alive either. They were something else, something in between, filled with frozen light that pulsed in rhythm with the breathing I could hear echoing through the building. The temperature display showed 45 degrees. I watched him for an hour. He never moved, just sat there, breathing frost into the air, staring at me with eyes that held all the cold and darkness of the glacier where he died. Where something had found him. Where something had decided to use him as a doorway. At 3 a.m., the emergency entrance buzzer went off. I knew I shouldn't answer it. Knew that nothing good would come from opening that door in the middle of a storm at 3 in the morning. But my hand moved anyway. Some part of me needed to know what was out there. What wanted in? The hunter stood in the doorway. He looked exactly like he had in his intake photo. Middle-aged, weathered face, practical winter gear, except his eyes were wrong, filled with that same frozen light. And his chest was moving, rising and falling in deep, slow breaths that sent clouds of frost into the air despite the storm, the shrieking wind. He didn't speak, just stood there, breathing, waiting for me to let him in. And behind him, in the darkness beyond the door, I could see shapes. Other shapes, moving through the snow, walking toward the morgue, toward me, bodies that had died in the cold. Bodies that had been taken to previous facilities. Bodies that the cold had claimed and was now using to come home. I slammed the door, locked it, backed away as something heavy hit it from outside. Again. The reinforced steel held, but I could hear them out there. Dozens of them, all breathing in unison, all trying to get in. Trying to reach the units where Marcus Webb and the elderly man waited. Trying to gather together, to combine their cold into something bigger, something that could survive outside the storm. I ran to the storage units. Webb was standing now, pressed against the door of Unit 5, hands flat against the metal, breathing so hard that frost had spread across the entire interior surface. The elderly man was doing the same in Unit 3, both of them facing out, toward the emergency entrance, toward their friends in the darkness. The breathing in the walls got louder, faster. The temperature in the building started to drop despite the heating system running full blast. I could see my breath, see frost forming on the windows, spreading in those same deliberate patterns. Reaching hands, open mouths, the shapes of bodies that wanted to be whole again. I had one choice left. The only one Chen had never explicitly forbidden because she assumed I'd never be stupid enough to consider it. I opened the units, both of them, at the same time, stepped back as Marcus Webb and the elderly man walked out into the hallway. They moved smoothly, gracefully, like they'd never been dead at all. Like death had just been a costume they were wearing, and now they were ready to take it off. They stood in the center of the hallway, breathing frost into the air between them, and the temperature dropped so fast that the pipes started to crack. The lights flickered, died, left me in darkness illuminated only by that frozen light in their eyes. Then they spoke, both of them, in voices that sounded like wind through ice caves, like the cracking of glaciers, like the last breath of everything that had ever frozen to death in the Arctic darkness. Thank you. They walked to the emergency entrance. I didn't try to stop them. Couldn't have if I wanted to. The door opened by itself. Or maybe they opened it. Maybe the cold opened it. Maybe it doesn't matter. They walked out into the storm, and the shapes in the darkness welcomed them, surrounded them, and together, all of them breathing in perfect rhythm, they walked away into the night. Back to the glacier, back to wherever the cold lives when it is not using dead bodies to move around. The storm ended at dawn. Chen arrived an hour later, found me in the break room, wrapped in every coat and blanket I could find. Still shaking. She didn't ask questions. Just looked at the empty storage units, at the frost patterns spreading across every surface, at the cracked pipes and shattered windows, and nodded like she expected this. Like this was just another day in Teller, Alaska. You opened the units, she said. They wanted out. They always do. That is why we keep them locked. Why we don't to process bodies during storms. The cold gets confused, thinks it can stay, thinks it can spread beyond the darkness and ice. But it can. It needs the storm, needs the glacier. So we keep them here until it passes. Until the cold realizes it has to go back. You could have told me. Would you have believed me? I couldn't argue with that. I quit the next day. Chen didn't try to stop me. Just handed me a check for the full month and told me not to talk about what I'd seen. As if anyone would believe me anyway. I left Alaska on the first flight south. Went back to Seattle, got my old apartment back. Started seeing a therapist who I lied to about everything except the insomnia. But I still hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the wind picks up and the temperature drops. Deep, slow breathing in the walls, in the vents, in the spaces between sleeping and waking. And I wonder how many others are out there. How many bodies the cold has claimed over the years. How many are walking around in the darkness, breathing frost into existence, waiting for the next storm to call them home. I wonder what Marcus Webb is doing right now. If he is still standing on that glacier, frozen solid, eyes open, breathing clouds of ancient cold into the Arctic night. If he is aware. If he remembers being human. Or if he is just a doorway now. Just another way for the cold to move through the world. I'll never know. And maybe that is better. But I'll tell you this. If you ever find yourself in Alaska during winter, if you ever see someone standing alone in the snow, breathing clouds of frost that seem too thick, too deliberate, if you ever hear breathing in the walls of an old building during a storm, walk away, Don, to investigate, Don, to try to help, Don, to assume you understand what you re-seeing, because some things aren't meant to be warm. Some things belong to the cold, and the cold always comes to collect what is yours. So let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed this breath on a winter day and thought it looked almost alive? Almost like it had substance? Almost like it was reaching for something? Write your answer in the comments below. Because I need to know if I'm the only one who sees it now. The only one who knows what's really breathing in the cold. Story 9. Snow Angels of Keenagik. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened in Keenagik. When they find perfect shapes pressed into fresh snow with no footprints anywhere around them, no tracks leading in or out, no explanation that makes any logical sense, most people would walk away. Most people would convince themselves they imagined it. I kept going back. That was my first mistake. I moved to Alaska in January to teach at Keenagik Elementary School. Population 377. The kind of place where everyone knows your name by the second day, and by the third day, they stop making eye contact. The school sat at the edge of town, a low building that looked like it was trying to disappear into the tundra. Gray walls, gray sky, white snow stretching in every direction until it met the frozen river. They hired me because the last teacher left without notice, just walked out mid-semester and never came back. The principal, a weathered woman named Margaret with eyes like chips of glacier ice, told me not to worry about it. People leave Alaska all the time, she said. The darkness gets to them. The isolation. She handed me the keys and a list of emergency contacts, then looked at me for a long moment before adding, "Stay away from the schoolyard after dark." I laughed. She did not. The first morning, I arrived an hour before sunrise. The school parking lot held only my truck, its engine ticking in the cold. Temperature was -23. The kind of cold that makes your lungs ache, that turns your breath to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. I grabbed my bag and started toward the entrance, my boots crunching through the snow. That is when I saw the first angel. It lay in the center of the schoolyard, maybe 30 feet from where I stood. A perfect snow angel, arms swept wide, legs pressed together, the impression so clean and detailed I could see the individual finger marks in the snow. But here's what stopped me cold. The snow around it was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks, no sign that anyone had walked there at all. Just pristine white powder surrounding this impossible shape, like someone had been lowered from the sky and then lifted straight back up. I stood there for 5 minutes, my coffee growing cold in my hand, trying to find a rational explanation. Wind does not create shapes like that. Animals do not lie down and sweep their limbs in perfect arcs. I walked closer, careful not to disturb the surrounding snow, and crouched at the edge. The angel was fresh. I could tell by the sharp edges, the way the powder had not yet settled or blown into the impression. This had been made recently, maybe in the last hour, inside the teacher's lounge. I asked Margaret about it. She was making coffee, her back to me, and I watched her shoulders tense at my question. "Just kids being kids," she said, but her voice had gone flat. "They like to play before school." I told her there were no footprints. She poured her coffee, added 3 sugars, stirred for much longer than necessary. "Kids are creative," she finally said, and walked out. The second angel appeared 3 days later. I had started arriving earlier, some compulsion I could not name pulling me out of bed at 4:30 in the morning. The school sat in darkness, the only light coming from the emergency exit signs visible through the windows. I parked in my usual spot and scanned the schoolyard with my headlights before turning them off. 2 angels this time, side by side. Same perfect impressions. Same complete absence of any tracks or footprints. Same impossible creation. But these were different in one horrible way. They were sized for children. Small, the kind of snow angels an 8-year-old might make. I got out of my truck with my phone, turned on the flashlight, and documented everything. The angels, the unmarked snow, the distance from the building. My hands shook, and not from the cold. I walked the entire perimeter of the schoolyard, searching for any sign of how someone could have made these without leaving tracks. Nothing. The fence around the playground was too far away. No trees overhead, no structures that could explain it. That afternoon, I stayed late grading papers. Most of the other teachers had left by 4, when the sun began its quick descent. Margaret stopped by my classroom before she left. "You should go home," she said. I told her I had work to finish. She looked at the windows, at the darkness pressing against the glass, and something moved across her face. "Fear, maybe, or memory. Lock your door," she said, "and do not go outside." I did not lock my door. I should have. Around 6 o'clock, I needed to use the bathroom down the hall. The school had gone completely silent. That particular quality of quiet that buildings get when they are supposed to be empty. My footsteps echoed off the linoleum. The fluorescent lights hummed and flickered. I finished and was walking back when I heard it. A child laughing, faint, distant, coming from somewhere outside. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, every nerve in my body suddenly awake. The laugh came again, high and clear, unmistakably the sound of a child playing. But it was after 6. In January, in Alaska, 20 degrees below zero. I walked to the nearest window and looked out at the schoolyard. 3 angels now, arranged in a triangle. Fresh impressions in the snow. Steam still rising from them in the cold air like they had just been made. And here's the part that made my stomach drop. I could see them being created. I watched as invisible weight pressed into the snow, arms sweeping outward, legs pushing down, the shapes forming in real time with nothing and no one there to make them. I ran. I admit it without shame. I grabbed my coat and bag from my classroom and I ran to my truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice in the snow. The engine turned over on the 3rd try. I did not look at the schoolyard as I drove away. I could not make myself look. That night, I searched online for information about the school, local news archives, historical records, anything that might explain what I had seen. It took 2 hours of digging through poorly digitized newspaper pages before I found it. December 1988. A girl named Sarah Kunuk, 8 years old, disappeared during a snowstorm. She had stayed after school to help her teacher decorate for the winter concert. When her parents came to pick her up at 5 o'clock, she was gone. They found her coat and boots in the classroom, her mittens on the floor, the door to the playground standing open. They searched for 3 days. State troopers, volunteers, dogs. They found nothing. No tracks in the snow. No sign of where she had gone. The storm had covered everything. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead from exposure. Her body was never recovered. But here's what made my blood turn cold. The article included a photo of Sarah. She was wearing a school uniform and smiling at the camera. And behind her, barely visible on the classroom wall, was a drawing. A child. A drawing of snow angels. Dozens of them. I called in sick the next day. And the day after that. Margaret left 3 voicemails. The 3rd one was different from the others. Her voice was tight, urgent. "You need to come in," she said. "It is getting worse." She hung up without explaining what that meant. I returned on Monday. The parking lot was empty except for Margaret's car. Inside, the school felt wrong. Too warm. The air thick and heavy like before a storm. Margaret was waiting in the main hallway. She looked like she had not slept. Dark circles under her eyes, hair unwashed. She grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Every morning for 37 years, she said, the angels appear. One for each day since Sarah disappeared. We thought if we ignored them, if we did not talk about them, they would stop. But they never stop. And every year, they get closer to the building." She pulled me to the window. The schoolyard was covered with them. Dozens, hundreds maybe. Perfect snow angels pressed into every inch of space, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at, spiraling inward toward the school in tightening circles. The innermost ring was less than 10 feet from the walls. "What happens when they reach the building?" I asked. Margaret did not answer. She was staring at something in the nearest angel. I followed her gaze and saw it. A small handprint pressed into the snow inside the angel's outline. And then another, and another, tiny frozen handprints appearing one by one, marking a path from the angels toward the school entrance. "We need to leave," Margaret whispered. "Right now." We ran for the doors. Behind us, I heard the sound of small footsteps. Running, getting closer. The temperature inside the school was dropping fast, our breath misting in the air. Ice was forming on the windows, spreading in fractal patterns that looked like reaching fingers. Margaret, his hands shook as she tried to unlock the front door. The key would not turn. "It is frozen," she said, her voice breaking. We turned to run for another exit and stopped. Sarah Kunuk stood at the end of the hallway. She looked exactly like her photo, 8 years old. Blonde hair in 2 braids, school uniform, but her skin was blue-white, crystalline, like she was made of ice and snow. Her eyes were completely black. She smiled at us, and when she opened her mouth, snow fell out instead of breath. "I want to go home," she said. Her voice sounded like wind through empty spaces. "I've been waiting so long. Why would no one help me find my way home?" Margaret dropped to her knees, tears freezing on her face. "I am sorry," she said. "I am so sorry. I was your teacher. I left the door open. I did not check. I did not know you had gone outside. I have lived with it every day. Please, I am so sorry." Sarah tilted her head, considering. Then she looked at me. "You found me," she said. "You looked for me when no one else would. You remembered my name." I did not understand what she meant. But then I realized I had searched for her story. I had read about her. I had said her name out loud. Maybe that mattered. Maybe that was enough. "Will you help me?" she asked. I did not know what to say. Did not know what she wanted. But I nodded. Sarah smiled again. And this time it looked almost human. Almost like the child she had been. "Come outside," she said. "Show me how to make one more angel. The right way. With someone who remembers." The front door unlocked with a soft click. Margaret grabbed my arm. "Do not go out there," she said. "Please." But I pulled away. I do not know why. Compulsion. Guilt. The sense that this was the only way to end it. Outside, the cold hit me like a physical force. The angels surrounded us, their impressions glowing faintly in the darkness. Sarah walked ahead of me, her bare feet leaving no prints in the snow. She stopped in the center of the schoolyard, in the one empty space that remained. "Here," she said. I lay down in the snow. The cold burned through my coat immediately, stealing the air from my lungs. Sarah lay down beside me. I could feel her presence, solid and freezing, pressing against my arm. Together, we swept our arms and legs through the powder. When we stood, 2 angels remained. Mine, rough and imperfect. And hers, flawless. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was already fading, growing distant. "Now I can rest." She looked at Margaret, still standing in the doorway. "And you can forgive yourself." Sarah Kunuk dissolved. There is no other word for it. She broke apart into snow and wind and vanished into the darkness. The temperature rose. The ice on the windows cracked and fell away. The hundreds of angels in the schoolyard began to blur and fade, erasing themselves from existence. By morning, the schoolyard was empty, clean, just smooth snow and silence. Margaret retired that week. I stayed until the end of the school year, then took a job in Anchorage. I do not teach in small towns anymore. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, I think about Sarah. About what it means to be lost and forgotten. About how sometimes the only thing a ghost wants is to be remembered. To have someone say their name. The snow angels stopped appearing at Keenagik Elementary. I checked. But here's what keeps me awake. Before I left town, I visited the cemetery. I found the small marker they had placed for Sarah, even without a body to bury. Someone had cleared the snow from around it recently, and pressed into that cleared space was a single perfect snow angel. Fresh, with no footprints anywhere around it. So here's my question for you. If something is trying to be remembered, trying to tell you its story, would you listen? Would you go outside in the cold and the dark to help it find peace? Or would you pretend you saw nothing, heard nothing, felt nothing pressing in around you in the night? Write your answer in the comments. Because I think about this every single day, and I am starting to wonder if Sarah was the only one who never found her way home.
Thank you for visiting to Midnight Whisper Stories. I am the creator of this channel, where every dark story is designed to help you escape the noise of the day and immerse yourself in words that spark your imagination. I write every script, design every image, hear voice actors to bring my stories to life, and edit everything myself. So sit back, relax, and let the whispers of the night guide you.